what I wanted to know, which I ask really all of my guests when they first walk into my office, especially if they're drawn from some very visible swath of pop culture, I just like knowing what kind of math background did they have? Did they have a science teacher that they liked? Is there some story they could share with us about that experience? And did that experience somehow influence their career path? And so let's check it out.
There was a math teacher who taught math using Alice in Wonderland, which was a lot of symbolic logic.
And Charles Dodgson was himself a mathematician.
Yes, and that was his specialty, symbolic logic. If this says this, then this means this, but then does that mean that?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily, yes. And I just loved it.
Quite creative.
I loved that.
How many people in this universe get to say, I had this wonderful math teacher? This is rare. This is rare.
Well, it is rare, and it shouldn't be rare.
It shouldn't be rare.
It shouldn't be rare.
But I'm telling you, it was the first time I ever heard that.
It's fascinating stuff. The next year, I had, a terrible math teacher, and my grades went straight down. Mm-hmm. And it just shows how much a teacher means. Maybe if I was somebody else, I could have just pushed through there and go, come on, I'm interested in it. But when I finished high school, I think it was a coin flip. I was either going to go to science, engineering, all that, or an art school. And it was kind of a coin flip, and I went and looked, and then I thought, art school looks more fun, at least in the first part of the ramp. And it looked like the science and engineering was a lot of hard work, and then you get to actually exercise your imagination. To me, there seemed to be no difference in the kind of the creativity and imagination that goes into either of those areas. I thought they're equivalent.
So let me ask you, so Monica, what's going on in the brain of a creative person when they're being creative?
Well, so what's interesting is that creativity, is a whole brain process. And
does that mean you use all parts of your brain?
Yeah, of course. So for example, at least in music studies and looking at musicians that are improvising, it's been shown that they have heightened activation in premotor areas, motor areas of the brain, so that they're obviously getting prepared to coordinate an action.
Wait, does that mean if you're highly trained and rehearsed at it, you don't trigger the motor parts of the brain as heavily because it's sort of
It's rote memorization almost.
Okay, so if you're going to up with something on the spot, what you're saying is there's more
heightened activation, yes.
Heightened activation
is the right term. It's all about
I'm
terminology,
with you. I'll be fluent with you. I'm hanging with you.
And so another really interesting finding is deactivation of prefrontal cortex. And prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive functioning, so being aware, moral thought, judgment, everything that makes us human.
So when you say executive, you mean high level?
High level thinking.
That's what you mean by executive.
We're not talking about the business.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Deal, yeah.
Right, okay.
Well, although that's kind of high level functioning too. And so there's what's called deactivation. So perhaps you have to turn off awareness to be in the zone, to be able to improv.
Well, there's an interesting fact that we've seen, or at least a hypothesis, let me put it at that level, where if you have unbridled space to be creative, it might actually interfere with your ability to be creative. And David Byrne actually wrote a book, and the title was How Music Works. But in there, he explores constraints on creativity and how that can actually stimulate creativity itself. Let's see what he says.
Music is affected by all the contexts that surround it. They were affected by the kind of acoustics of where it's performed. They're affected by the technology that records the music or the technology from the people that make it, the instruments and all the other stuff. They're affected by the financial stuff, how you get paid or not paid, or how you make a living as a musician. Affected by how you...
We, the consumers of music, never think about that.
Yeah, we just think it just comes.
It just comes.
It just pours out.
It comes out of you.
It's like water coming out of a tap.
Yeah.
But there's all these factors that affect it. And it's sometimes unconscious. People know that if this is what can be reasonably done in this space, in this room, and for this amount of money, they'll start to kind of self-edit and restrict themselves to thinking within those parameters, which is not a bad thing at all.
I was going to say exactly that. In engineering, the last thing an engineer wants is, invent this thing for me, and you have unlimited money and unlimited constraints. No, that's not where you extract the creativity of an engineer. You get the creativity by saying, okay, here are the parameters. It's got to do this under these conditions, under this temperature, and it's got to fit in this box and run on this much power. Go. Then, oh my gosh, this is a playground for the engineer.
Yes, and the same is true. It's certainly true for me.
So the constraints are not really constraints. They are
No, they're liberating.
liberating.
They allow you to kind of, okay, the clearer I know what is the box that I need to work within, the happier I am. Then I can, it eliminates the infinite number of choices and whatever. That I would just
That's
be
what it
lost in
is.
there.
You've reduced the variables.
Yeah.
And mathematically speaking, if you have too many variables, you can't
Nothing.
constrain the system.
Yeah.
So you've got to tighten out, you've got to clamp down on some of the variables. Leave a few that you can then manipulate and
Exactly.
then get the thing to work.
Yeah. Art and science have that in common.
So the two of you are both creative people in your own ways. Do you agree? I mean, we kind of agreed, I agreed with David that constraints are actually a good thing, not a bad thing, and in a way they're liberating. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. Like, definitely how much money you have to do something, or like how much time you have to do something, totally helps. Like, if you're just like, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write a book about whatever, you'll just be there.
Well, when we come back on StarTalk, we will pick up my interview with David Byrne, and we'll talk about experimentation. Of course, we do that in science, but apparently it's also a fundamental part of art when we return. And the band Talking Heads, I think it dissolved in 1991, and that's many years ago. So what's he been up to? Well, recently he did something he had never done before. And so I asked him about it, and here it is.
This year I'm doing a project where I'm bringing together 10 high school and slightly older color guard teams. There's the kids with the flags and the sabers and the rifles and all these things that they do, with 10 kind of live musicians, 10 groups of live musicians who have written music especially for these teams, and see what happens. There's a little bit of tightrope walking there, and trying to figure out, okay, how much can I play around and experiment and still find a way for it to kind of pay for itself, and not just be like an indulgence. But I've kind of navigated that throughout my life. Part of the interest is in finding these kind of pockets of creativity that are going on. I mean, the musicians I know, I admire them, I love a lot of what they're doing. This other stuff is something that I don't know, that I kind of stumbled on, and I go, look, there's all this kind of creativity. It's outside of my world. New York has never heard of it. It's going on out in all these other little towns, and they're passionate, they're dedicated to what they're doing, and they're creating this crazy stuff. Somebody needs to bring that up and show some love and appreciation for what people are doing outside of kind of the official cultural channels.
Is that anything different philosophically or spiritually from George Harrison learning about the sitar at a time when no one really knew what the sitar was in the West? Is that the same thing as Paul Simon going to South Africa, bringing some of those sounds in? They're going on and serving their niches, but maybe there's a place to give them a new birth or a different kind of flavor.
There's a similarity, yes.
Because everybody's got music.
Yes.
Everybody's.
And some people are, what they're doing is sometimes so beautiful and sophisticated, and you can learn so much from it. This other stuff, though, is more homegrown. It's more like, oh, there's something in my own backyard that I didn't know was there.
I'd never heard of this concept before. Homegrown creativity, maybe drawn from the firmament in your locale, speaks to the value and need for experimentation, which is something we do in the science lab, of course. It's deeply associated with that activity. So Monica,
But
tell me.
so is art.
Tell me about it.
Art is experimentation.
Tell me about it.
I mean, both art and science are about, you have a question, right? You have variables that you start manipulating and testing, and then you have a product, an outcome. I just described the scientific method as much as the artistic method. And so I think, I mean, they're identical, really. It's just the tools that you use. That's what's different.
Well, here's an interesting difference, Maeve. When you experiment, you can bomb.
Yes. Well, I've never personally bombed, but I've definitely seen guys in particular who can't do it. And yeah, it's brutal. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like you went wrong or like you did it bad, but it's just not the results you were hoping for. In our case, that's a laugh. And the opposite of a laugh is like silence or like something being thrown at you. And that's a tough one.
Yeah, but can't we also note here that in science, I can perform an experiment, and if it works, it works, and it's not subject to anyone's interpretation or anybody's emotional state. Whereas you, as artists, if you're performing artists, as both of you are, you have to feed a mind state. And maybe it feeds this mind state and not another one. Maybe it feeds Tuesday night and not Friday night. So that's kind of different compared to my experiment in the lab.
The reaction part of it.
If I get a different result on Friday than I did Tuesday, I messed up in some really bad way.
Well, because science is about
You'd have to tell me that
reproducibility.
Fridays has an effect on my experiment. And we invented the days of the week, right? The days of the week have no
Nothing.
astronomical
Yes, correct.
relevance at all.
Yeah, so I think then the one difference between art and science is that science is about reproducibility.
Yes.
But art is all about creating something new every time. If you reproduce it, it's not art in the sense of novelty. I would dare to say.
I like that. Well, when StarTalk comes back, we will pick up my interview with David Byrne, and we will explore the relationship between music and architecture on StarTalk. Featuring my interview with David Byrne, and in this next segment, I want to get straight to it because he has a highly innovative idea regarding music and architecture. Let's just see where he takes us on this topic.
When there's certain size rooms that sound a certain way, the natural kind of artistic evolution is that the music that gets performed in them should sound the best in that room. The easiest one maybe to imagine is, say, a Gothic cathedral. The music that's generally heard in there is very kind of long notes, not a lot of complicated harmonies or chord changes, nothing very quick and rhythmic.
It seems to me that would get lost in the resonance, in the echoes of the chamber.
And the music that works best in that is the music that was written to be played in those spaces. It allows for those long echoes, and the long echoes actually enhance the music and make it sound more spiritual and awe-inspiring and of the cosmos, whatever. But you can then imagine, say, as people sometimes mistakenly do, and saying, let's have this, we're going to have this percussion ensemble play in the cathedral because what a beautiful venue. And you realize what a sonic and cultural disaster that would be too. It just becomes this cacophony of noise.
Right.
And you just go, God bless, but this is the wrong kind of music for this room.
So he developed this concept in his book, what was it, How Music Works. In there, he elaborates on how the evolution of music has co-moved with the evolution of the spaces in which it has been performed. And he gave the opposite example, the inverse example, where you have a small club. And do you bring in, monks to sing Gregorian chants in a small club? No, the music is different. And if the music doesn't sound good in that space, it's not invited back to play in that space. So there's this filtering that puts music in their proper venues. And I was intrigued by this, first by the acoustics of it, the fact that he thought about it. And I was just wondering, Maeve, you have a certain joke. Is it funny in every size venue? Are you venue influenced?
Totally. Totally. Comedy works
Not partially,
best
but
in...
totally. Okay. I want to one day hear the word partially come out of your mouth. Okay.
Totally. Comedy works best in small venues. I feel like the more intimate, I don't know if it's to do with sonically or not, or if it's to do with actually it's a conversation, so you want to be close to them and you want to let them breathe and you say something and them but I feel like
So
I would say
it's
that
more
because
of an approximation of a one-on-one thing.
Right,
Okay.
like a conversation. But then when comics get really successful, they book arenas. And then people often say it's a disappointing experience because arenas are supposed to be like, for what? Like sport, rock, music,
Right.
sports, you know, so you lose something.
But there's another issue regarding how we receive our music. And there was a day when it was only live because there were no recordings. Now there are recordings. Well, what is or then there was radio, and then there were recordings. And how do you, in terms of what's portable and you take around with you, we take around the recordings. And sound quality is an interesting, it's not always the same. And does it influence your appreciation? These are interesting questions that I asked. And I wanted to know what David Byrne thought about it. Let's check it out.
When I was junior high, whatever, 12, 13 years old, something like that, and I first started listening to music on the radio, it was on a little transistor radio about that size that you would kind of sneak into bed and quietly listen to it under your pillow. And the speaker was that big.
It was tinny?
It was tinny. The sound on a contemporary smartphones is probably better than what was on those things. But at the same time, it's still kind of very limited. And I realized the music that I was hearing out of this crappy little thing changed my life and made me realize, well, you hear this really crappy thing, but there's enough information there for you to know there's a world out there. There's people doing things that are...
It's a portal.
It's a portal, and you go, there's people doing things that I didn't know about, and it's speaking directly to me. That little thing with the crappy sound does all that. So I thought, okay, fidelity and the kind of beautiful sound that can be produced is not... It's wonderful, but it's you can't demand it. The crappy sound can have a huge effect as well.
So, Monica, what does he mean by fidelity? He's not talking about commitments to relationships. He's talking about sound fidelity. So,
Well, good sound quality. I mean, the information is all the raw information that you have. You're hearing every bit of it, every piece of it.
so fidelity is the reproduced music versus the music that was played, because you might lose something going from one to the
Right.
other. Okay, so he's arguing against this.
Like that you don't need it, right?
Well, not to be influenced by it. I have to agree with that. Would you agree?
I think it depends on context. I mean, because he said, you know, this little crappy thing, but because I was in my room listening, I mean, it has emotional content, and I think it's a cross
He's under
between,
his pillow in his bed.
Yeah, I mean, he's having a fun time, and I think that's affecting his experience with that. And also, there's the question of just art in general. If it's meant to have an expressive quality, you'll get it no matter how you're hearing it.
Well, when StarTalk returns, we will go into our Cosmic Queries mode. And we've been discussing sort of creativity, how it manifests in art and in science. And I had an hypothesis that creativity in science is fundamentally different from creativity in art. Now, you'd probably disagree, as did David Byrne. But why don't you hear me propose it to him? You'll hear his reply, and I desperately am interested in how you react. Let's check it out. Einstein discovers relativity, and he's a brilliant genius and all the like. But none of us would ever say that without him, relativity would never be discovered. Somebody would discover it later, or some combination of people, it would come out of, it would rise up. Whereas if Beethoven never composed his Ninth Symphony, nobody is, ever. So the work of art is singular in space and in time, whereas the work of the scientist, it may be a little ahead of its time, but its time will always come.
Gee, I would argue that nobody's going to write Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but somebody's going to write something that partakes of a lot of the same elements. It may not be as good, but whatever, the zeitgeist or whatever,
Inspired.
they're inspired by what is available at that moment, the instruments, the concert halls, what kind of orchestra you can put together, what's available, who's commissioning, how much the commissioner will put up with as far as innovation. All those factors, I think, will allow something to emerge that is maybe not as good, certainly not the same, but in the same universe, as opposed to, it's not going to, what I'm saying is, it's not going to sound like Bach. it's going to sound more closer to Beethoven. This is just me saying, and that at any moment, I would think, and I could be completely wrong, that when there's a Beethoven, there are lesser Beethovens kind of orbiting around, sometimes much lesser, and that we will never, ever care about.
Some have chaotic orbits.
Yeah, whatever. And that the zeitgeist says that, yeah, I'm really suspicious of the kind of singularity idea that there's whatever the great man theory of history or whatever that might be, or the arts, where I do feel like there are certain people where lots of the factors come into focus, and that person just
the benefit of buoyant forces.
Yes, they kind of buoy to the top and shoot up like a fountain.
So, he's thinking there's a universe in which Beethoven creates, and others are in that universe, so we don't have to think about whether someone will create that exact symphony. And I was just saying, people praise that symphony, and people praise relativity. But without that symphony, there is no symphony for people to praise. But without relativity of Einstein, somebody would have come up with it later. That's all I was trying to say there. So, Monica.
I think what science is looking for, sort of absolutes, ideas, concepts that are independent of us.
Yes, independent of our own creativity.
While the Beethoven example, or the Bach, or whoever it is
exists only within us.
Yeah, it's totally personal, but it's also dependent on society and culture, your environment, context again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a Bach and there can only be a Bach, but that doesn't mean that other individuals who were around at his time would be influenced by similar factors. But because each person is unique with different experiences, they will use all of that in different ways.
So when StarTalk returns, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence as a source of creativity, possibly supplanting the greatest creativity we've ever expressed as humans. You know, there's a big issue, probably in other places in the world, but we feel it a lot here in the States. The funding for arts education is always under stress. And the school boards are wondering, do we cut the art? Do we keep the science? And there's tension. We know this. And I brought that up with David Byrne, and he had strong views on that as well. Let's check it out.
In order to really succeed in whatever math and the sciences and engineering like that, you have to be able to think outside of the box, and you have to be creative problem solving. And the way those disciplines are taught is not totally creative. The creative thinking...
Not at all.
Not at all. It's more like, this is this, this is this, this is this. The creative thinking is in the arts. A certain amount of arts education doesn't mean that your ambition is to grow up to be a painter, but you can use that kind of thinking and apply it to anything else, business, engineering, science.
And be better at it.
And you're better at that. You succeed more and you bring more to the world because you have these abilities that came from outside of your discipline. So bringing different worlds together has definite tangible benefits, and to kind of cut one or separate them is to injure them and cripple them.
You know, I basically agreed with everything he said in these interviews. I mean, he's a deep thinker, he's creative, he's educated, and so his thoughts they're put together in ways that really resonated with me. When I think of culture, what do I think of? I think you visit other countries and then they show you what it is that makes them them and not you. And in almost every case you do this, you are looking at their art. You are looking at their architecture. You are looking at aspects of their civilization that has been empowered by science and engineering. And so for anyone to say, let us cut art for anything else, suppose they did that back in Renaissance Europe. What would Europe be without the support and interest in a thriving culture of art? As we readily spend money to visit these cities and go to their museums, to turn around and say, now I'm going to cut the art budget here, That makes no sense to me. And it may be that science and art, which we know sort of go together, the arts and sciences are colleges of institutions. It may be that art and science thought of in that way are the only true things that we create that last beyond ourselves. Everything else comes and goes. The leaders, the politics, the economies. So am I biased? I don't know. But what I do know is if there is a country without art, that's not a country I want to live in. If there's a country without science, you're living in a cave. We measure the success of a civilization by how well they treat their creative people. And I'm just fortunate as host of StarTalk to have two creative people here for this show. So thank you, Maeve. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, David Byrne, for showing up in my office for that interview. You've been watching StarTalk from the American Museum of Natural History. I've been your host, Neil deGrasse Tyson, your personal astrophysicist. And as always, I bid you to keep looking up.